Ethan Parker, a seasoned hiker from Seattle, found himself at a crossroads, both emotionally and literally. His life had crumbled in a single day, unraveling into something he could barely recognize. Just weeks ago, he had caught his fiancée and his best friend in a betrayal that shattered him to the core. Seeking escape from the pain that weighed on him every waking hour, he packed up his gear and got in his car and left the city. He didn't have a destination in mind, only the vague plan to drive until he found the kind of wilderness where he could disappear, even if only for a few days. Montana's Bitterroot National Forest was wild and remote, known for its untouched landscape of sprawling trees, rugged mountains, and secluded trails. The forest felt like the perfect refuge, somewhere he could lose himself in nature's silence and let the sting of betrayal fade. His heart still felt heavy as he drove down the narrow, winding access roads, each turn leading him further from civilization and deeper into the forest's vast, intimidating embrace. Finally, the road ended at a grassy clearing where he parked his car. A light drizzle began to patter against his windshield as he gathered his gear and checked his phone, a habit of modern life that now felt almost intrusive. As expected, there was no signal. Here, in the heart of the forest, he was well and truly alone. Stepping out of the car, he took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the damp, earthy scent of rain-soaked leaves and moss. It was a smell that calmed him, grounding him in the moment. He mentally marked his car's location before setting off toward his destination, a scenic overlook atop one of the nearby ridges, several miles from where he parked. Hiking alone in unfamiliar terrain was a risk, but he'd spent years honing his survival skills and trusted his instincts. For this journey, he wanted the solitude, even the tension of being completely self-reliant in a landscape that could turn hostile without warning. The trail wasn't marked, but he'd mapped out a general route to follow on his phone. Despite lacking service, he knew his GPS would still function offline, a trick he'd learned over years of solo hikes. He moved swiftly through the forest, his steps muffled by the thick carpet of wet leaves. Each footfall felt like it was taking him further from the troubles of his past and closer to some unspoken peace he hoped the wilderness could provide. In his mind, the Bitterroot Forest was a kind of sanctuary, a place where he could finally confront his thoughts without distraction or judgment. After nearly an hour of steady hiking, light rain began to fall harder, softening the earth underfoot and turning the path ahead into a slick challenge. Ethan cursed under his breath. Rain had always been his one pet peeve. It made hiking more treacherous, sapping the joy of each step. Reluctantly, he turned back toward his car, the trees around him now blurred in the mist of rain and early evening shadows. He felt a sense of mild frustration at having to abandon the hike, but convinced himself he could try again the next day. As he approached the edge of the clearing, his frustration quickly transformed into dread. His car was exactly where he'd left it, but something was terribly wrong. All 4 tires had been slashed, each one deflated and mangled as if by a knife. He felt a sudden, intense fear twist in his gut. This wasn't an accident, and it wasn't random. Someone had deliberately sabotaged his way out. Ethan stood frozen, staring at his car, his mind racing to process the grim reality before him. 4 slashed tires, deep gashes in each one, deliberate and malicious. The forest, which had felt like a quiet sanctuary just moments ago, now seemed sinister, cloaked in shadows that hid unknown eyes. He scanned the trees surrounding the clearing, half expecting to catch a glimpse of a figure watching from the dark, but saw nothing. Silence blanketed the forest, interrupted only by the gentle patter of rain, now heavier, pooling in the deepening tracks of his hiking boots. The absence of any immediate threat didn't calm him. In fact, it only heightened his sense of vulnerability. With no cell service and no other vehicles in sight, he knew he was alone. The closest stretch of civilization was a good 20 miles back down the narrow, winding access road he had taken to get here. Walking that distance felt daunting, and more importantly, dangerous. He would be entirely exposed along the open road, an easy target if the person who slashed his tires was still nearby. Trying to ignore the wave of panic rising within him, he forced himself to think logically. He replayed his original route in his mind, remembering the overlook he'd planned to reach. It was situated high on a ridge, and with any luck, he might get a bar or two of cell service up there. It was a gamble, but it was his best option. Steeling himself, he adjusted his pack, turned his back on the clearing, and plunged back into the depths of the forest. Each step away from his car felt like a step deeper into a nightmare, but there was no other choice. The trail was more difficult in reverse, the rain-soaked ground making every step a potential slip. Every now and then he thought he heard faint rustling sounds coming from behind him, a slight disturbance in the leaves, the barely audible snap of a twig. He stopped several times, holding his breath, listening intently, but each time he heard nothing but the gentle, persistent rain. Telling himself it was just his nerves, he pressed on, setting a brisk pace to cover the ground quickly and stay ahead of whatever invisible threat seemed to be stalking him. As he climbed, the sun sank lower in the sky, casting long, skeletal shadows through the trees, twisting branches into monstrous shapes. The light was fading fast, adding another layer of urgency to his escape. His nerves were fraying with each minute that passed, and even his seasoned hiking instincts couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. Despite his best efforts to maintain composure, his heart pounded louder than his footsteps, a constant reminder of his vulnerability. Halfway up the ridge, he dared a quick glance over his shoulder. Through the dim, rain-soaked forest, he saw nothing unusual, yet he couldn't shake the feeling of eyes boring into his back, watching his every move. He sped up, quickening his steps, every nerve alive with dread. Reaching the overlook couldn't come soon enough. He hoped desperately for even the faintest cell signal, a lifeline out of this unsettling game of cat and mouse. But he also knew that, alone in the forest, he was far from any guarantee of safety. Finally, after what felt like hours of climbing, Ethan reached the overlook. He staggered to the edge, his legs burning from the steep ascent, but he barely noticed the breathtaking view of the valley below. His focus was on his phone, which he pulled out with shaking hands, willing it to show some semblance of a signal. Relief flooded through him as a single bar flickered on the screen. He quickly dialed 911, his voice low and urgent as he described his situation. The slashed tires, the isolated location, and the disturbing feeling of being followed through the forest. The operator's calm voice steadied him as he recounted each detail. She assured him that help was on the way, but the reality of his situation pressed down on him. The nearest emergency services were miles away, and he'd still have to find a way back to his car before nightfall. Hanging up, he felt a sliver of relief. At least now, someone knew where he was. But as he turned to leave, he knew that his ordeal was far from over. With the sun sinking lower, casting the forest in an eerie half-light, Ethan faced the daunting task of retracing his steps back to the clearing. He took a deep breath and plotted his route, deciding to take a wide, arcing path that would avoid his original trail. He hoped that this detour would allow him to sidestep any potential ambush points or traps, but the forest seemed darker now, its shadows longer and denser, as though closing in around him. Ethan moved cautiously, each step measured and deliberate, trying to avoid making noise. Yet, barely 10 minutes into his descent, he heard it again, a faint rustling, this time closer, more distinct. He froze, listening as the sound seemed to follow his every move, staying just far enough away to remain out of sight. His skin prickled with fear, his senses screaming that he wasn't alone. For a moment, he considered shouting, making his presence known to whatever, or whoever, was out there. But instinct told him to stay silent. The forest grew darker as he descended, shadows thickening around him, making it hard to distinguish tree trunks from lurking figures. As he cautiously made his way down the slope, he stumbled upon a small clearing, and what he saw there stopped him cold. A makeshift campsite sat in the center, hidden away in the dense foliage. 12 logs encircled a long-dead campfire, charred remnants scattered across the ground. Ethan's heart raced as he took in the eerie arrangement. There was something ritualistic, almost ominous about the sight. As he circled the campsite, he caught movement out of the corner of his eye. He whipped around just in time to glimpse a figure ducking behind a tree, a bare, muddy foot disappearing into the shadows. Panic surged through him, and he broke into a run, crashing through the underbrush with little care for the noise. The pursuit was no longer subtle. He could hear multiple sets of footsteps now, growing louder, closing in. Risking a look over his shoulder, he saw them. Several figures, their faces obscured, dressed in faded white garments, moving through the forest with unsettling speed and purpose. Adrenaline and fear drove him forward as he sprinted toward his car. His legs felt like lead, but he couldn't stop. He knew his life depended on it. In the clearing ahead, he saw the flashing lights of a police vehicle and nearly collapsed with relief. He stumbled toward the car, gasping for breath, collapsing against the hood. When he looked back, the figures were gone, swallowed by the shadows of the forest, as if they'd never been there. The officer approached him, steadying him as he caught his breath, the comforting presence of safety finally sinking in. Later, as he recounted his ordeal, the officer warned him about Bitterroot's strange history, of reclusive groups and the whispers of cult-like gatherings deep in the uncharted woods. Ethan shivered, the weight of the experience settling over him. As he drove away with the officer's reassurance, he knew he'd never return to the forest again. The Bitterroot had taken something from him that night. The comfort he once found in solitude, replaced forever by a haunting reminder of how close he'd come to becoming just another mystery lost in the trees. Derek Lawson, an avid hiker and seasoned adventurer, was always searching for new places to explore. Over the years, he had developed a passion for seeking out lesser-known trails, remote locations, and especially areas with an eerie reputation. When he learned about the deserted Dunmore Woods in the heart of Connecticut, he was immediately intrigued. The forest had an unsettling history that locals rarely spoke about, a place abandoned for generations, where the trees stood in deathly silence, devoid of any sign of wildlife. Rumors abounded about why the forest was so empty. Tales of strange symbols carved into the trees, eerie sounds echoing in the stillness, and a chilling darkness that seemed to linger long after the sun went down. Unfazed by local superstitions, Derek dismissed the stories as myths and set his sights on the forest. He arrived around noon, hoping to have enough daylight to explore and make his way back out before nightfall. The first thing he noticed was the absolute silence. There was no wind, no rustling leaves, no birds, just a heavy, suffocating quiet that seemed to press down on him. It was unnatural, unsettling, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Derek shrugged it off, convincing himself that the silence was simply the lack of human and animal presence. After all, few people dared venture into Dunmore Woods, and any animals might have avoided the forest simply because of its isolation. As he moved further into the dense trees, Derek placed his custom-made trail markers, small, brightly colored stickers he attached to tree trunks. It was a habit he'd developed over the years to ensure he could always find his way back. Each marker was unique, designed to be instantly recognizable, and he placed one every few hundred feet to mark his route. The forest's silence began to feel almost stifling, and he found himself growing uncharacteristically uneasy. Even in the most desolate trails he'd hiked before, there had always been some sign of life. But here, it was as if the entire forest had been frozen in time. As he ventured deeper, Derek couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He kept telling himself it was just his mind playing tricks, that he was reacting to the forest's unsettling reputation. Still, every step he took felt heavier, as if an invisible weight were pressing down on him. Suddenly, he heard a sound that broke the oppressive silence, a low, mournful wail that seemed to come from deep within the woods. The sound was faint, but unmistakable, a chilling moan that resonated through the trees and sent a shiver down his spine. He stopped in his tracks, straining to listen, trying to determine what could have made such a noise. But the forest was silent once again. Derek shook off the unsettling feeling, chalking it up to his imagination. After all, he wasn't one to get spooked easily. He continued on, telling himself that if he encountered one more strange occurrence, he'd consider heading back. But as he pressed on, he couldn't ignore the growing sense that something was very wrong in Dunmore Woods. Derek continued deeper into Dunmore Woods, his senses on high alert. As he placed each trail marker, he kept glancing around, expecting something, anything, to break the eerie silence. but the forest was still and lifeless. His footsteps seemed to echo unnaturally, the only sound in the deadened air. Minutes turned into an hour as he ventured further, winding through narrow paths and ducking under low-hanging branches. The feeling of being watched gnawed at him, and despite his efforts to brush it off, it grew stronger with each step. He came upon a towering tree in the middle of the path, its trunk scarred with strange carvings. Symbols, not words, twisted around the bark in haphazard patterns. Each carving was a mix of slashes and symbols that didn't resemble any language he recognized. Derek stared at the marks, an uncomfortable prickle creeping up his spine as he scanned the tree, wondering who could have done this, and why. This wasn't the usual graffiti he'd come across on trails, and the depth of the cuts suggested intent, like someone had made them as a form of ritual. He glanced at the other trees nearby and saw similar carvings scattered around the forest, as though marking a boundary or warning. A shiver ran through him, but he forced himself to keep moving. He wasn't about to let a few eerie symbols scare him off. Yet, as he turned back onto the path, he noticed something else that made his heart skip a beat. One of his trail markers, which he had placed at eye level, now hung lower, closer to his waist. He froze, staring at it, his mind racing. Derek knew he hadn't placed it that low. He never placed them below eye level. Someone had moved it, intentionally and quietly, without him noticing. The realization sent a wave of unease through him, and he felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. His pulse quickened as he surveyed the forest, but there was no sign of anyone else. He tried to reason it away, telling himself he must have placed the marker lower without realizing it, or that maybe it had slid down somehow. But the explanation didn't sit right. His gut told him something was wrong, something he couldn't rationalize. Swallowing hard, he pressed forward, this time with a heightened sense of urgency. Every few steps, he found himself glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to catch a glimpse of someone hiding among the trees. After a few minutes, he heard the wailing again. This time, it was closer, louder, a gut-wrenching sound that seemed to come from all directions at once. It echoed through the silent forest, reverberating off the trees, filling the air with a raw, chilling intensity. Derek's heart pounded as he tried to pinpoint the source, but the sound seemed to weave through the trees, shifting unpredictably. Panic prickled at the edges of his mind as he realized he was no longer alone in the woods. He turned, trying to retrace his steps, but then he noticed something even more unsettling. His markers were gone. Derek's breath quickened as he turned away from the unsettling campsite, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew he had to get out of these woods, and fast. But with his markers gone and the forest seeming to twist around him, he had no clear path. His every instinct screamed to run, yet he forced himself to move cautiously, afraid that a single misstep might send him deeper into whatever dark presence lurked in these woods. The eerie silence enveloped him once more, pressing down as if the entire forest were watching, waiting. As he moved, he heard it again, the sound of footsteps, distant but purposeful, echoing through the dense trees. This time, there was no mistaking it. Whoever was out there wasn't trying to remain hidden anymore. They were tracking him. His skin crawled, and despite his best efforts to remain calm, he broke into a sprint, darting between the trees, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in on him, as though the forest itself were conspiring to keep him trapped within its depths. The wailing began again, piercing and guttural, closer now, and as Derek ran, he caught sight of figures moving in the periphery of his vision. Shadows shifted between the trees, fleeting glimpses of people, or what looked like people, moving with an unnatural swiftness. They wore robes, tattered and stained, blending seamlessly with the forest's dark, muted colors. He didn't dare look too closely. Fear drove him forward, overriding the pain in his legs and lungs as he pushed himself to escape. He stumbled, his foot catching on an exposed root, and fell hard to the ground, the impact jarring his bones. Dazed, he struggled to pull himself up, but as he did, he felt the ground beneath him shift. Just inches away, partially hidden by leaves and dirt, was a deep pit lined with sharpened stakes. The realization hit him. He'd narrowly avoided a trap. Heart hammering, he backed away from the pit, his mind racing as he pieced together the horrifying truth. These woods weren't just eerie, they were a carefully constructed labyrinth, designed to lure and trap those who enter. Regaining his footing, Derek bolted in the opposite direction, the twisted laughter and whispered chants of his pursuers seeming to blend with the wind. The forest was alive with movement now, the shadows closing in as he stumbled through the trees. Finally, through the tangled branches, he spotted the faint glimmer of light filtering through, a break in the trees that he prayed would lead him out of this nightmare. With one final burst of energy, Derek broke through the forest's edge, emerging into a grassy clearing just as the sun dipped below the horizon. He didn't stop running until he reached his car, gasping for breath, his body trembling from exhaustion and terror. Fumbling with his keys, he managed to unlock the door, throwing himself inside and locking it behind him. As he looked back at the edge of the forest, he half expected to see the shadowy figures watching him from the tree line, but there was nothing, only the silent, still trees. Driving away, Derek felt a chill settle over him, the weight of the experience pressing down on him. He knew he would never return to Dunmore Woods, never again seek out places whispered about in hushed tones. The forest had let him go, but he sensed it was only because it wanted him to remember, to carry the darkness of what he had witnessed as a warning to others who might be tempted to enter. And even as he sped down the road, he couldn't shake the feeling that the forest's eyes were still on him, watching, waiting for the next soul to wander too far into its shadows. Growing up, Ryan's house was the hangout spot for him and his friends. His dad had transformed the basement into a massive man cave with an endless stash of beer, and his parents didn't mind if he and his friends partied there, as long as they stayed out of trouble. Ryan's property was also bordered by a dense stretch of woods, a place he and his friends used to explore when they were kids. At the far end of those woods was an old, worn dirt road that led to a secluded reservoir. This reservoir was off-limits to civilians, but to Ryan, it had always been his refuge. He'd cut through the fence a dozen times over the years, carving his own secret passage to the reservoir's quiet banks where he'd go to think, to smoke, and sometimes just to escape the world. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ryan and his 4 closest friends, Trevor, Noah, Jason, and Malik, were getting restless. They'd been shooting pool in the basement, music blasting, when Trevor suggested they make a run to the reservoir. The idea was met with immediate enthusiasm. They hadn't been there in a while, and with the day's fading light, it promised the kind of thrill they all craved. Ryan hesitated for only a moment. They'd been drinking, and the woods were wet from an earlier rain, but he knew the route by heart. Besides, he thought, they'd all been through those woods 1,000 times. What was there to worry about? After grabbing a few beers for the journey, they slipped out through the backyard and into the thick wall of trees. The woods seemed darker than usual, with the damp earth giving off a musky scent that mingled with the cool evening air. The sounds of laughter and the crackle of leaves underfoot echoed as they navigated the familiar trails. When they reached the cut fence, they squeezed through one by one, finding themselves on the reservoir's edge. The place was nearly silent, save for the occasional ripple in the water and the soft whispers of wind through the trees. They climbed up to their usual hangout spot on a small cliff overlooking the water, but tonight, something felt different. A strange quiet hung in the air, as if the reservoir itself were holding its breath. Ryan brushed it off as paranoia, but he couldn't shake the unease settling over him. After a while, Trevor suggested they explore the other side of the reservoir, a section they rarely visited. It was an idea that made them all hesitate. That part of the reservoir was secluded, a place shrouded in shadows and dense trees. But they were in the mood for adventure, so throwing caution aside, they set off along the edge, laughing and joking as they walked. The further they ventured, the quieter they became. Their laughter faded, and a strange tension filled the air, making the hair on Ryan's arms stand on end. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Ryan saw something moving in the distance on the far side of the reservoir. A dark figure, hunched and lumbering, dragging something heavy. As the figure came closer, he realized it was pulling a large, dark bag, its contents shifting ominously with each tug. Ryan's pulse quickened as he watched the figure struggle toward the water with the heavy bag. His friends had gone quiet too, each one of them staring, transfixed, at the scene unfolding on the opposite bank. The figure, still shrouded in darkness, stopped near the edge of the reservoir, bending over the bag with slow, deliberate movements. Although they couldn't see the person's face from this distance, there was something unnervingly calm about how they moved, as though they were performing a practiced, almost ritualistic task. The quietness of his friends felt heavy, charged with a shared but unspoken understanding of what they might be witnessing. Just as Ryan was about to whisper something, he noticed more movement along the tree line. 2 more figures emerged, each dragging their own dark bag, accompanied by a 4th figure carrying what looked like a kayak balanced over their shoulders. Ryan's breath hitched. He'd heard rumors of strange things happening around the reservoir, but he'd always brushed them off as small-town ghost stories. Now, as he watched these figures and the scene before him, a cold dread settled over him. The figures seemed to operate in sync, moving without hesitation as if they'd done this before. The first figure climbed into the kayak, while the others helped load one of the bags into it. With a smooth push, the figure paddled out toward the middle of the reservoir, disappearing into the mist that had begun to rise off the water. Moments later, Ryan and his friends heard a faint splash, and the figure returned to shore, where the other bags waited. One by one, each bag was loaded and transported to the middle of the reservoir, each disappearing with the same eerie splash. Ryan's mind raced, his imagination filling in the horrifying possibilities of what could be inside those bags. He wanted to turn and run, to grab his friends and get out of there, but it was as if fear had rooted him to the spot. Just as the last bag vanished below the water's surface, Ryan's phone buzzed, the ringtone cutting through the eerie silence like a knife. In an instant, all 4 figures froze, their heads snapping up to look in his direction. Ryan fumbled with his phone, his fingers clumsy with panic as he tried to silence it. The eerie quiet that had cloaked the reservoir shattered, replaced by a suffocating tension as the figures on the shore locked onto the boys' location. In the dim light, Ryan could see their expressions, or lack thereof. Their faces were pale, hollow, blank, as if void of any humanity. Trevor nudged Ryan, a look of terror on his face, mouthing the word, "Run." Without another word, they all bolted, scrambling over rocks and branches as they made their way back along the edge of the reservoir, desperate to reach the path that led back through the woods. But as they ran, they could hear the footsteps behind them, heavy and relentless, closing the distance with terrifying speed. Ryan didn't dare look back, afraid of what he might see, but he could feel the presence of their pursuers, hot on their trail, as the darkened woods swallowed them whole. Ryan's heart hammered as he sprinted through the woods, his feet slipping on the damp ground as he pushed himself to run faster than he ever had. The sound of footsteps behind him grew louder, and he could hear his friends' ragged breaths as they scrambled to stay ahead of the figures chasing them. Branches whipped at his face, and the darkness pressed in from all sides, making it hard to see more than a few feet in front of him. Panic clawed at his chest, but he forced himself to keep going, following the barely visible path that led back to his backyard. Up ahead, the glow of the fence came into view, the one small break in the chain link where he and his friends had cut through so many times before. Relief flooded him as they reached it, but just as Ryan squeezed through, he realized Jason was still on the other side. His foot caught on something. Ryan turned back, grabbing Jason's arm and pulling him through the gap, his hands trembling as he glanced over his shoulder. The shadowy figures were closer now, their faces illuminated in brief flashes of moonlight as they moved toward the fence. Their eyes were empty, fixed solely on the group as they advanced with terrifying purpose. Once they were all on the other side of the fence, they didn't stop. Ryan and his friends tore through his backyard, across the open lawn, toward the safety of his house. His lungs burned, but he pushed himself to run faster, every nerve on edge as the chilling thought pressed into his mind. What if the fence didn't stop them? The figures had felt almost inhuman, moving with a determination that seemed to defy explanation. Finally, they reached the back porch, bursting into the house and slamming the door behind them. Ryan locked it, his hands shaking uncontrollably, and they all collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. For a moment, everything was silent, the only sound their labored breaths as they tried to make sense of what had just happened. Trevor reached for his phone to call the police, his voice barely a whisper as he recounted what they'd seen. But deep down, Ryan knew the explanation would sound absurd. Figures in the woods, bags sinking into the water, a desperate chase back to safety. When the police arrived, they took the boys' statements, searching the backyard and the edge of the woods for any sign of the figures or clues as to what had happened. Ryan watched as the officers moved through the trees with flashlights, half expecting to see the shadows lurking just beyond the beam of light. After a thorough search, the police found nothing, but they promised to keep an eye on the area and patrol the reservoir in the coming days. In the following weeks, Ryan couldn't shake the feeling of dread that lingered over him, a cold weight that refused to lift. The reservoir felt like it was calling him, whispering reminders of that night. Late one evening, he stumbled across a local news article. A body found in the reservoir, reported missing just days before he and his friends had witnessed the figures on the shore. As he read, a chill ran down his spine, and he realized he might never truly escape the shadow of that night. The woods and reservoir, once his sanctuary, had transformed into something sinister, leaving him with a memory he would carry forever. The authorities labeled it as an unsolved mystery, but Ryan knew better. He knew that something still lurked in those woods, waiting for the next group of friends to make their way to the water's edge and stumble into a nightmare that might never let them go.